It started with admiration. After several joint missions in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, a team of U.S. Army Green Berets had seen firsthand how the Australian SAS moved through the jungle. Not like soldiers, but like ghosts. No sound, no sign, no hesitation. They watched them lie motionless for hours, track enemy movement with animal patience, and vanish into the trees before the first drop of rain hit the ground. And somewhere between admiration and professional pride, a decision was made. We can do that too. The idea wasn't born from arrogance. These were experienced men, combat-proven, fluent in local languages, and trained to operate independently behind enemy lines. The Green Berets were no strangers to stealth or unconventional warfare. But what they had witnessed with the SAS was something deeper, quieter, colder. Not stealth by necessity, but stealth by identity. They wanted to replicate it. The plan was simple: a long-range reconnaissance patrol into an NVA-controlled sector near the Cambodian border. No CIDG irregulars, no Montagnard auxiliaries, just 6 Americans moving in full silence. No radios, no gunfire, no contact unless absolutely necessary. They would become the forest, like the Aussies did. Move slow, speak less, fire never. The captain in charge had even read after-action reports from previous SAS missions, took note of their habits: wrapping gear in cloth, taping down metal, smearing mud on shiny surfaces, syncing movements with wind patterns. His men prepped accordingly. They blacked out insignia, dulled their blades, repacked their rucks for minimal sound. It felt right. It felt sharp. They inserted by helicopter at last light. No flares, no greetings. Just boots in mud and the steady hiss of rotors fading into the canopy. They moved single file, 10-meter spacing, no light, no words. The jungle swallowed them whole. For the first few hours it worked. The forest accepted their presence. Branches didn't snap underfoot. Insects resumed their calls. They moved like shadows. It was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Because slowly, and they didn't realize it yet, the difference began to show. One man reached for his canteen and the cap clicked. Another shifted his pack and it rustled against nylon. The point man wiped sweat from his eyes and disturbed a low-hanging vine. Small sounds, innocent sounds, but in a jungle where the birds went silent when strangers came near, these sounds echoed like alarms. They thought they were ghosts. The jungle disagreed. The first lesson had begun, and no one had taught it to them yet. Not in words, not in doctrine. Just the green walls of Vietnam, watching, and waiting. By the second night, the Green Berets were still convinced it was working. No contact, no noise beyond the forest's natural rhythm. They'd covered just over 2 kilometers in nearly 20 hours, moving slow, deliberate, just like the SAS. But there was one problem. They were exhausted, not from movement, but from holding everything in. Every itch they didn't scratch. Every breath they held too long, every shift they suppressed until pain burned down their spine. It added up. Silence, they were learning, wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of tension, and they were losing the thread. The Australian SAS made this look easy. During joint patrols, the Aussies barely spoke, didn't cough, didn't swat at leeches. They moved like they belonged there. The jungle didn't fight them, it ignored them. But for the Americans now alone in that same space, it felt like the jungle was resisting, closing in, testing them. That night, during a short halt near a dry creek bed, a beret shifted to get comfortable. His boot grazed a root and snapped a dry twig. Not loud, but wrong. 3 birds launched into the canopy, shrieking. The jungle hushed. The patrol froze. No one spoke. But something had changed. On SAS missions, moments like this were instinctively managed. A silent gesture, a finger to lips, a change in posture. The patrol would blend, flatten, vanish. But the Americans weren't there yet. They didn't know the unspoken choreography. The tension spiraled. One man clicked his safety off, too loud. Another reached for his map. Paper rustled. The team leader whispered, "Hold position." But the whisper carried farther than he realized. A Green Beret in the rear turned to look back and brushed a fern, which shook just enough to catch the moonlight. And that was enough. Later, no one could say exactly when they were spotted, But someone had been watching, listening, just like they were supposed to be doing. At 2:30 hours, the first sign came, a rustle on the ridge, followed by silence. Then again, closer. They scanned with night-adapted eyes, hearts pounding. Nothing. No confirmation, no movement. And then, nothing again, which was worse. Because in Vietnam, the jungle didn't stay quiet without a reason. The patrol held position. No talking, no lights. Just eyes and rifles in the dark. The team leader looked at his watch. He marked the time. Something was out there, but they couldn't find it, couldn't trace it. They had tried to mimic the SAS, mirror the silence, the control, the patience. But now they were learning the hard truth. You don't imitate the stillness of ghosts, you earn it, step by quiet step, mistake by costly mistake. And somewhere, less than 50 meters away, the enemy was learning too, that these weren't the Australians. Not this time. The first shot didn't come with warning. It came as a sharp crack from the tree line, followed by a burst of automatic fire that sent rounds snapping overhead. Muzzle flashes lit the jungle like lightning trapped under leaves. The Green Berets hit the ground hard, returning fire in short bursts, but they were already on the back foot. Whoever was out there had the high ground, knew the angles, and, worse, knew they were coming. The firefight was brief, 2 minutes, maybe less, but in jungle time, it felt endless. One man took a round through the thigh. Another was clipped along the shoulder. When the shooting stopped, the jungle collapsed back into silence, thick and choking, not peaceful, waiting. The Green Berets didn't shout. They moved quickly, dragging the wounded back, applying pressure dressings in the dark, whispering radio checks. Their discipline hadn't vanished, but their stealth had. They weren't invisible anymore. They were prey. The team leader cursed under his breath. He knew what had gone wrong. Somewhere along the way, maybe with that snapped twig, maybe with the rustled map, the enemy had picked up their trail, not by magic, just by the same methods the SAS had warned them about. Watching bird flight, broken silence, the unnatural stillness of men who tried too hard to disappear. The difference was simple. The SAS didn't look like they were hiding. They looked like they were part of the jungle. The Americans, for all their effort, still looked like soldiers, just quieter ones. And now they were being hunted. They moved before first light, slower than before, but with a different kind of focus. Not imitation, but survival. Every route was suspect. Every tree could hide an eye. They didn't speak. They didn't breathe hard. They just moved, like ghosts that knew they weren't alone anymore. When they finally reached their planned extraction zone, the clearing was quiet. Too quiet. No sign of enemy, but the jungle didn't feel right. The birds hadn't returned. The trees weren't moving. A faint buzz in the radio cut through the silence. Delay on pickup. Weather patterns shifting. ETA, 30 minutes. The wounded man groaned, barely conscious. The team leader scanned the tree line again. He didn't see movement, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. For the first time since the mission began, one of the Green Berets muttered something aloud. Not to the team, but more to himself. I miss the Aussies. It wasn't a joke, because in that moment, every man in that patrol realized something no briefing had taught them. The SAS didn't disappear because they were trying to. They disappeared because they had to. Because in Vietnam, being seen wasn't a mistake, it was a death sentence. And the jungle never gave second chances. The radio went dead 5 minutes before pickup. No static, no confirmation, just silence. The kind of silence that the Australians would have understood. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something waiting. The Green Beret team leader rotated the antenna, toggled the backup frequency, whispered into the mic again. Nothing. The air was thick, unmoving. Even the insects had gone quiet. One of the newer team members, Private First Class, fresh from stateside, asked, "Should we move to the alternate LZ?" He said it too loud. The team leader gave him a look that didn't need translation. No, not now. Movement was risk. The jungle was already watching. And so they waited. Each man with his rifle up, eyes scanning the tree line. The wounded soldier lay pale and sweating, his tourniquets slowly failing. Every second that passed drained more than blood. It drained certainty. At the 20-minute mark, the enemy showed their hand. Not with an attack, but with a whisper, a faint sound, something brushing against foliage, far left flank, then silence again. The kind of silence that plays with the mind, that makes shadows look like men, that forces you to ask, did I hear that? Or am I hearing myself? The Green Berets formed a tighter perimeter, adjusting arcs of fire. But the angles were bad. The LZ was too open on one side, too closed on the other. A natural funnel, a trap. They'd chosen it for the helo, not for survival. And this was the other lesson the SAS had hinted at, though never directly. Never trust the map. Trust the ground. On paper, the LZ worked. In reality, it put their backs to the slope and left them blind to movement in the underbrush. Then came the first shot. A single round, not a burst, a test. It hit the dirt a few feet from the perimeter, deliberately off mark. A warning, or worse, a signal. Because seconds later, the jungle opened up. Controlled fire from multiple angles. Rounds cracked through branches, slapped the trunks. The Berets responded immediately, trained muscle memory kicking in. Two returned fire while the others dragged the wounded behind a fallen log. But the enemy wasn't committing. They were probing, drawing fire, learning the team's shape through the noise. And in that chaos, the Americans understood what the SAS had meant when they said, if you fire first, you've already lost. Because now their position was known. And whoever was out there, NVA regulars, VC guerrillas, maybe both, they weren't rushing. They were waiting, patient, like hunters who knew the terrain better, like ghosts who didn't need to see their prey, only hear it. The Green Berets had tried to mimic that kind of silence. But silence, they were learning, wasn't just about sound. It was about presence. And right now their presence was painted in gunpowder and blood. The firefight faded again. No shouting, no charge. Just silence folding back over the clearing like a trap resetting itself. They weren't trying to kill the Green Berets, not yet. They were shaping the battle. The team leader knew it. This wasn't a frontal assault. This was jungle chess. Sound, silence, spacing. A slow tightening of nooses. Each shot before had been a feeler, testing response times, trigger discipline, even ammunition reserves. And worst of all, it was working. The radio still refused to speak. One man tried to scale a nearby tree for better signal, but the canopy was thick and slick from monsoon rain. Halfway up, a branch snapped. The sound cracked across the LZ like a rifle shot. And just like that, the shadows answered. A single burst from an enemy RPD shredded the trunk. The man clung tighter, heart racing. Then another burst. Not aimed to kill, aimed to pin. He dropped back down, pale and sweating, his silence louder than a scream. The wounded soldier was fading fast. His name was Adams, 23. Kansas farm boy, first tour. He'd stopped speaking now, eyes glassy. The blood-soaked bandage on his leg had gone from red to almost black. The team medic whispered something about internal bleeding, something about not making it through the hour. They needed extraction, but the jungle didn't care about timelines or ranks or promises. It only cared about patience. One of the older Green Berets, a sergeant who'd done 2 tours already, broke the silence, just a whisper. We shouldn't have tried to move like ghosts. The others didn't respond, but they all felt it. Because they hadn't earned the silence. They'd copied it, worn it like a borrowed uniform. But the jungle saw through it. The SAS had become invisible by surrendering to the rhythm of the land, letting it dictate their pace, their breath, their decision-making. These Americans, hardened though they were, still moved with intent, still pushed. And now they were being punished for it. Just then, a rustle, not enemy this time, from the opposite side. A soft, padded footfall. Then 2 shadows emerged from the foliage. Faces green and black, rifles down, eyes calm. Australian SS. No radio call, no warning, just sudden silent presence. The lead SAS trooper knelt beside the team leader, whispered with clinical precision, "We've been tracking you since yesterday. You're not alone anymore. No emotion, no judgment, just fact." Then they melted back into the brush. 3 more shapes followed, equally silent. They weren't here to fight. They were here to extract. A different kind of war was about to begin. Not loud, not glorious, but surgical. The kind where you didn't win by firing more bullets. You won by never being seen again. And for the Green Berets, it was the beginning of a lesson they would never forget, taught not with lectures, but with footsteps that left no trail. No orders were barked, no formation was called. The Australian SAS didn't issue commands, they moved. And that was the order. Two of them took point without a word, weaving through the underbrush like smoke between trees. One paused only long enough to glance at the wounded Green Beret, Adams, before gently taking the stretcher handle without a sound. The other SAS trooper took rear guard, rifle up, eyes blank and scanning. His presence said everything. If anything moves, it dies quietly. The Americans followed, not out of protocol but out of necessity. The jungle swallowed them within 30 seconds. No light, no sound, just the pulse in each man's ears, the soft rhythm of boots finding bare earth, and the occasional whisper of a branch pushed aside. The SAS moved on instincts honed by months in the bush. They avoided trails not because they were mined, but because they were expected. Instead, they threaded the team through dense ferns and root systems, using terrain as both camouflage and shield. One Green Beret tried to whisper a question, how far to the next LZ? But the SAS corporal in front didn't turn around. He simply raised one hand slowly, palm out. Stop talking, breathe quieter. Even the medic, who was applying pressure to Adam's wound, did it with practiced silence. Every motion counted, every breath rationed. After nearly 40 minutes of steady movement, the lead SAS halted beside a downed tree. Not to rest, to listen. Not a single one of them had looked at a compass, yet they knew exactly where they were. Then it happened. From the ridge behind them, a voice, not American, not yelling, calling. Vietnamese, a single word, then another, followed by silence. The NVA had reached the old LZ, but the trail was cold. The SAS had already led them miles off the predictable route, using the terrain as misdirection. Upstream instead of downstream. Ridge hugging instead of valley dipping. They didn't flee, they bled direction from the hunt. By the time the enemy figured out they were chasing ghosts, the SAS had already taken the team into a ravine choked with fog. Finally, after hours of near-ritual movement, the point man raised a hand. The backup LZ. A small rise barely big enough for a single chopper to set skids. The Australians pulled the perimeter tight. No words, just glances. The SAS signaler opened a pouch and unwrapped what looked like a piece of black cloth. It was, in fact, a coded IR marker. No radio traffic, no flare. Just a signature that the inbound pilot, already briefed, could spot under NVG. Within 10 minutes, they heard it. The chop of rotors, still distant. The Australians didn't react. They simply blended deeper into cover. The Green Berets watched in awe. They'd come into the jungle thinking they could move like phantoms. But these men were phantoms. And for the first time, the Americans weren't leading the exfil. They were being guided out by those who knew how to disappear long before they'd ever arrived. The Huey never circled. It came in low and straight, no floodlight, no gunfire. Just controlled descent through tree breaks the SAS had identified hours ago. The pilot trusted them blindly. This landing zone wasn't on any map. It didn't need to be. The second the skids touched soil, the SAS troopers moved. Swift, silent, efficient. On hand signal, and the Green Berets began lifting Adams onto the chopper. The wounded soldier didn't cry out. He hadn't for hours. He just blinked slowly as the rotor wash lifted mist and leaves into a whirlwind. The Americans started climbing aboard, but two SAS men didn't follow. They crouched just outside the tree line, eyes still scanning. One glanced at his watch, not out of impatience, but precision. They'd calculated the gap, the time between enemy realization and gun range. There were 3 minutes left. Inside the bird, a Green Beret looked out the open side and locked eyes with one of the Australians. "You coming?" he mouthed. The SAS man shook his head slowly, then pointed back into the jungle. "We stay." The Americans didn't understand at first, but the team leader, the one who'd called this extraction, did. Cover force, final sweep, phantom work. The SAS would vanish again, just as they had appeared, ensuring the enemy didn't follow, didn't see the lift, didn't triangulate the trail. Not because they had to, because that's what masters of absence do. The Huey lifted off, blades tearing at the mist. Below, the jungle swallowed its own secrets. No muzzle flashes, no movement, just green. In the days after, the Green Beret team returned to base subdued, changed. There were no speeches, no medals waiting, Just the slow unpacking of soaked gear, the smell of mud and blood still clinging to fatigues. But something was different now. The radio operator rewired his antenna setup like he'd seen the SAS signaler do. The medic repacked his kit for absolute silence. And one of the younger troopers, the one who'd tried to mimic SAS movement on the first day, now practiced stepping barefoot across gravel, feeling each stone, listening to his own weight. The team leader filed his report bluntly. Extraction successful, one casualty stabilized, enemy contact avoided due to Australian SAS support. Recommend further joint ops and doctrinal cross-training. But privately, he wrote something else. A note to himself. They weren't just quieter. They were deeper. Like the jungle wanted them there. We wore stealth like camouflage. They became it. Far away back in the bush, the SAS patrol moved through fog again. Same silence. Same formation. No acknowledgement of the mission just completed. One of them paused only to tighten a bootlace. Then he whispered, "They'll learn." The other SAS trooper didn't respond. He didn't need to. The jungle already had. Weeks passed. The jungle didn't change. The rain still fell sideways. The air still pressed down like a weight. And deep inside the triple canopy, patrols continued. Some by Americans, some by Australians. A few, quietly approved, were now joint. But something had shifted. The Green Berets, who had once believed in motion, aggression, and dominating terrain, now moved with a different rhythm. They still carried firepower, still had bite, but their edges were quieter, sharpened by stillness, tempered by patience. One afternoon, a senior MACV-SOG officer visited the FOB where the Joint Patrol had launched. He asked for feedback, results, anything actionable. The Green Beret team leader looked him in the eye and said, "Sir, we didn't just see how the SAS moved. We saw how we didn't." That night, a revised field manual draft quietly changed. It added a new line under reconnaissance principles. Observation is not presence. Disappearance is not retreat. No one cited the Australians. They didn't want it to be about credit. They wanted it to be about survival. Far deeper in the bush, the SAS team sat motionless on a ridgeline. A new joint mission was scheduled for dawn. Word was another American unit would tag along. Different team, different expectations. The SAS didn't mind. They never did. One of them, the corporal who had touched the Green Beret's rifle to stop him from firing too early, adjusted his scope. Slowly, carefully. Then he whispered to the patrol leader beside him, "Reckon they'll listen this time." The patrol leader didn't smile, just replied, "They don't have to listen. Just watch long enough." Back at base, the wounded Green Beret, Adams, was healing. Slowly, but he talked. A lot. Not about the wound, not about the firefight. About the moment before it. When the SS patrol leader whispered, 10 more meters, cut them in half. He said it like he'd seen the entire battle in advance. Like he wasn't just ambushing men, but timing gravity, wind, fear. Adams called it the moment I realized I'd been loud my whole life. The other Green Berets laughed, but not too loud. Years later, after Vietnam, those same Americans trained new generations. Some taught at Fort Bragg. Some moved into clandestine units. A few never said where they went. But here and there, inside the words of instructors, the spacing of patrols, the gaps between breaths, a trace remained. A pause before movement. A refusal to step on the loud path. A silence inherited. In the official records, that joint mission barely takes up a page. Joint Recon Patrol, contact minimal. 1 WIA, extraction successful. No one mentioned how close the enemy had gotten. No one wrote about the tension, the restraint, the green blur of men who became trees. But if you find an old operator, one who was there, and ask him what stuck, he might pause, look past you, and say something like, "We thought we were ghosts. Then we met the men who didn't have to pretend."